Okay, Shabbat Shalom. Welcome everybody to today's study in the Torah portion. Today we'll be starting the last book of the Torah, which is the book of Devarim or Deuteronomy. So we're starting a new book, but it's the last book in the cycle for this year, and it's Devarim. The Torah portion is called Devarim, which means words. And it's found in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 1, through chapter 3, verse 22. So it's a rather short Torah portion compared to other ones we've had in the past few weeks. But also today is a special Shabbat, at least until sunset. It's what's called Shabbat Chazon. Shabbat Chazon, and Chazon means vision. So it's the Sabbath of vision. And that's going to be found in Isaiah chapter 1, verse 1 through 27. And this is also the last it's the last reading of Affliction. It's the third last reading of Affliction. Remember, we're within what's called the 3 weeks of Affliction, which has to do with the 9th of Av. This Wednesday evening at sunset starts the 9th of Av. We just started the month of Av last Tuesday evening. So this Wednesday evening starts the 9th of Av, and if you recall, the 9th of Av is the day that both temples were destroyed, the first temple and the second temple. And so it's a day of fasting. And also the 9th of Av is a day where a lot of adversities and tragedies have happened to the Jewish people. Besides the destructions of the temples, we've also had that when the spies came back from spying the land, and the 9th of Av is when they gave the bad report to the people. And so that caused them to wander for 40 years instead of being able to go into the land. So Wednesday night, we start the 9th of Av. So with this book of Devarim or Deuteronomy, today I'll be using the Complete Jewish Bible. If you're using this one, it has a very good introduction to the book of Deuteronomy. And it gives you a nice little summary of the book. And it also has some very good comments in relations to this Torah portion. So another name that they give to the book of Devarim or Deuteronomy is Misnei Torah. Misnei Torah. Misnei Torah. And what that means is repetition of the Torah, because basically what Moses is going to do is do a repetition. He's going to go over all the things that the people of Israel went through during those 40 years in the wilderness. So it's called Mishneh Torah, which Mishneh means repetition. And Deuteronomy in the Greek, deutero means the same thing. Some people translate it as the second law, but it's not the second law. What they're trying to say is the repetition of the law or the repetition of the Torah. So during this time, what we have, another interesting thing about the book of Deuteronomy or Devarim is that Moses is speaking in the first person, because it's Moses directly speaking to the people instead of being that God said to Moses and then Moses said to the people. Okay, so this time is Moses completely directing his speech to the people. And another thing that the commentaries say is that this book has approximately, it was probably written within a 40-day period. When it starts to the end, and then we have that Moses dies usually. So the book is, the recounting lasts around 40 days. And during this time, what Moses is doing is basically, it's like a discourse where he's saying goodbye to the people. It's a time where he's saying his goodbyes, and he goes through a series of things where he narrates all the things that have happened. He also gives like a reprimand to the people because of all their actions that happened during this time. Remember all the times they got mad and they spoke against Moses and Aaron and against God and all the things that happened. But then also in part of the things that Moses is going to be doing during the discourse is also he's going to take a time to bless the people. He's going to be giving some blessings, and he's also going to be reviewing the covenant that God has made with the people of Israel. And why is Moses doing all this, repeating all this stuff and going over the things that happened during these 40 years? Is because you have to remember that the generation that's going to go into the land is a new generation. It's most of the people that were born in the wilderness. Because we know that the majority of people that came out of Egypt, especially the men that had been counted in the first census to go to war, which was from 20 to 60 years of age, all of those died with the exception of Caleb and Joshua. Okay, so we have that. This is what's going to be happening in the book of Deuteronomy. So if you have your Bible with you, please go with me to chapter 1 of Deuteronomy, or Devarim. Chapter 1, verse 1, and it says the following. These are the words. Words there is the word Devarim, which means words. These are the Devarim Moses spoke to all Israel on the far side of the Jordan River, in the desert, in the Arava, across from Suf, between Paran and Tophel, Lavan, Hatzerot, and the Zahav. It is 11 days journey from Horeb to Kadesh Barnea by way of Mount Seir. So what he's saying is here is that it's the 11-day journey from Horeb, which is Mount Sinai, to Kadesh Barnea. Kadesh Barnea is right in the boundary to go into the promised land. So remember that the first time they got there, after they crossed the Red Sea, they were at Mount Sinai, and it was an 11-day journey from Mount Sinai to the promised land. They got there to Kadesh Barnea, but then they decided to send out spies, and when the spies came back, they came with a bad report, and the people got all frustrated and upset, and they were worried that they were all going to be killed. And so they stopped believing God about the promised land. And so what happens, they're right there at the border to cross into the land, and God says, now go back because you didn't believe. And so he made them, after they got there, they were just about to cross into the land. He made them go back, and for 40 years, they had to go around and around until that generation that did not believe died. So Moses is going to go over all these things, because you have to remember that there's a new generation that didn't see the things that happened in Egypt. And there's a generation, this new generation, the majority of them is the one that's going to go into the land. So Moses is giving them kind of like a summary. So kind of like an advice, like saying, you know, your parents, the people that came out of Egypt did all these things. Please don't do the same things they did. Try to improve, try to believe God, try to follow the covenant. And then when you go into the land, things will be a lot better. Okay. So it says in verse 3, on the first day of the 11th month of the 40th year. So we have that the 11th month, according to the Hebrew calendar, is the month of Shevat, not Shabbat, Shevat. Okay, that's the 11th month in the Hebrew calendar, and is in the first day, so therefore it's a new moon. It says on the first day of the 11th month, which is Shevat, of the 40th year, Moses spoke to the people of Israel, reviewing everything Adonai had ordered him to tell them. This was after he had defeated Sihon, king of the Amorites, who lived in Heshbon, and Og, king of Bashan, who lived in Ashtaroth at Edrei. There, beyond the Jordan in the land of Moab, Moses took it upon himself to expound this Torah and said. So Moses is taking time to explain a lot of things that maybe he didn't have a chance to explain before. Okay, because remember that he knows now that he's going to die, but he had to do a few things before he died to make sure that the people are ready to go into the land. Verse 6, Adonai spoke to us in Horeb. Remember, that's Mount Sinai. He said, you have lived long enough by this mountain. Turn, get moving, and go to the hill country of the Amorites and all the places near there in the Arava, the hill country, the Shephelah, the Negev, and by the seashore, the land of the Canaanites and the Lebanon, as far as the great river, the Euphrates River. Basically, he's talking about all the borders of the land. All this describes the borders of the land. I have set the land before you. Go in and take possession of the land Adonai swore to give to your ancestors, Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, and their descendants after them. So God is telling them, this land is ready. Just go in and take possession of it. At that time, I told you, you are too heavy a burden for me to carry alone. Adonai, your God, has multiplied your numbers so that there are as many of you today as there are stars in the sky. Remember, that was one of the promises that God gave to Abraham, that the people would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. Verse 11, may Adonai, the God of your ancestors, increase you yet 1,000-fold and bless you as he has promised you. But you are burdensome, bothersome, and quarrelsome. How can I bear it by myself alone? Pick for yourselves from each of your tribes men who are wise, understanding, and knowledgeable, and I will make them heads over you. So what he's trying to say is that during this time, it was too much for him to handle all these people and all the issues. So remember that even though it's not mentioned here, it's when Jethro, his father-in-law, gives him the advice, why don't you get you some guys that help you out. And so 70 men were chosen. And you have to remember that that's the episode where basically that is the beginning or the legal president of the Sanhedrin. So these judges, basically these 70 men are going to be what's called the Sanhedrin or Sanhedrin, whichever you want to call it. 70. Now we know there was 70 plus 1 because that one was the Nasi, or the what's called the president or the head of the Sanhedrin. So it was going to be 70 men, and the extra one is the one that would make decisions when the 70 came into a lock and they could not decide about something. So these judges that are chosen are the beginning of the Sanhedrin. Verse 14, you answered me, what you have said would be a good thing for us to do. So I took the heads of your tribes, men wise and knowledgeable, and made them heads over you. Leaders in charge of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens, and officers tribe by tribe. Because also you have to remember that the great Sanhedrin, which was the 70 men, those were in Jerusalem. And then you had smaller judges. So basically this is going to be the court system to handle judgments, to handle justice in the land. So in different places around the land where the tribes are going to be settling, they're going to have smaller groups of judges. But when those judges couldn't handle the situations, they went to Jerusalem. It's like us, we have the state courts, and we have the federal courts, and we have the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court would be the Sanhedrin. Verse 16, at that time I commissioned your judges, hear the cases that arise between your brothers, and judge fairly between a man and his brother and the foreigner who is with him. You are not to show favoritism when judging, but give equal attention to the small and to the great. So he's giving them advice about, you just don't accept, money. Don't try to favor the rich people over the poor people. So try to do things justly and fairly. He says, no matter how a person presents himself, don't be afraid of him because the decision is God's. So basically, these judges had the responsibility of giving a judgment. And what he's telling them, you say whatever God is telling you to say. And we have to remember that even though these were individuals that had their faults, and we know that in the future, in the first century, when Yeshua was walking the earth, many of the judges and many of the people in the temple were corrupt. But the issue is not the people. The issue is the office that they represent. Because their office and their position, that's what you have to respect. And that's the thing that had to be understood that was coming from God. So even though these people might have been corrupt, the decisions that they made were inspired by God to do the right judgment. And the thing about the Sanhedrin is that any judgment that was made was based on the Torah. Everything was based on the Torah. And then he says, the case that is too hard for you, bring to me and I will hear it. I also gave you orders at the time concerning all the things you were to do. So we left Horeb, which is again Mount Sinai, and went through all that vast and fearsome desert, which you saw on the way to the hill country of the Amorites, as Adonai our God ordered us. And we arrived at Kadesh Barnea. There I said to you, you have come to the hill country of the Amorites, which Adonai your God is giving to us. Look, Adonai your God has placed the land before you. Go up, take possession as Adonai, the God of your ancestors, has told you. Don't be afraid. Don't be dismayed. And then this is the issue that happens. You approached me, every one of you, and said, let's send men ahead of us to explore the country for us and bring back word concerning what route we should use in going up and what the cities we will encounter are like. So they wanted people, some men, to go into the country to know exactly which way they were going to go in. The idea seemed good to me, says Moses. So I took 12 of your men, one from each tribe, and they set out, went up into the hills, came to the Eshcol Valley, and reconnoitered. They took some of the produce of the land and brought it down to us. They also brought back word to us. The land Adonai, our God, is giving to us is good, very good. But, here's the but, you would not go up. Instead, you rebelled against the order of Adonai, your God, and in your tents you complained. It's because Adonai hated us. Now you have to remember that God did not hate them. And that the term hate or love in this context has to do with covenant. Okay, anytime you see the words hate or love, it has to do with covenant. It's not really about feelings. It has to do if you're faithful or unfaithful to the covenant. It's because Adonai hated us that he has brought us out of the land of Egypt only to hand us over to the Amorites to destroy us. What sort of place is it that we're heading for? Our brothers made our courage fail when they said, the people are bigger and taller than we are. The cities are great and fortified up to the sky. And finally, we have seen Anakim there. Now, Anakim was a family of individuals that were very, very tall. Some of them say they were probably like 9 feet tall. So, of course, you're going to be afraid of people like that because not only were they tall, but they were big, they were robust. So they were afraid of them. Verse 29, I answered you, don't be fearful, don't be afraid of them. Adonai your God, who is going ahead of you, will fight on your behalf, just as he accomplished all those things for you in Egypt before your eyes. And likewise in the desert where you saw how Adonai your God carried you, like a man carries his child along the entire way you traveled until you arrived at this place. Yet in this matter, you don't trust Adonai your God. So the issue is that they stopped trusting God. They really never really trusted him. And so when you have these spies coming back, giving this report, now they're even more discouraged. Even though he went ahead of you, seeking out places for you to pitch your tents and showing you which way to go by fire at night and by a cloud during the day. Adonai heard what you were saying, became angry and swore, not a single one of these people, this whole evil generation, will see the good land I swore to give to your ancestors. Except Caleb, the son of Yefune, he will see it. I will give him and his descendants the land he walked on, because he has fully followed Adonai. The word there is shalem, that he had a heart that was shalem, which means was completely into God, into believing and trusting God. So again, when he says this whole evil generation, he's talking about the men that were counted in the first census. Those men that were counted for war, ages 20 to 60, are the men that were counted and are the men that didn't believe the report of the Lord. So they discouraged the people. And so because of that, God says that none of them will enter the promised land. So then he says, we're in verse 37 of chapter 1 of Deuteronomy. Also because of you, Adonai was angry with me and said, you too will not go in there. Joshua, the son of Nun, your assistant, he will go in there. So encourage him, because he will enable Israel to take possession of it. So remember that is Joshua, which is Yehoshua, and Yehoshua means Yah is salvation. And Yeshua, the name Yeshua, is a shortened way of Yehoshua. So basically that's telling us that through Moses we get the Torah, through Moses we get the instruction, but it is through Yeshua that we come into the kingdom. Okay, so God is telling Moses, encourage Joshua, because he's now going to take over. Verse 39, moreover, your little ones who you said would be taken as booty, and your children who don't yet know good from bad, they will go in there. I will give it to them and they will have possession of it. But as for you yourselves, turn around and head into the desert by the road to the Sea of Suf. In other words, remember that they were right there, about ready to cross into the land. The spies report discouraged them. So God's saying, go back to the Red Sea from where you came. Remember, it was only 11-day journey from Mount Sinai into the promised land. They're right there. They're about to get in. They started not trusting the Lord. And so now they have to go back. It's like, I don't know if you've ever been in an airport where you've been running, you're making a connection and you don't make it. By the time you get to the gate, the door of the airplane has been closed. And once it's closed, you can't get in. So imagine you've flown from who knows where, you're carrying your bags, you're running, you're out of breath, you get there and the door's closed. So this is what happened to these people. So now they had to go back. So instead of going right into the land, now they have to wait 40 years so that all that generation that did not believe, that gave the bad report, died. Can you imagine if you were a neighbor to one of those guys? Because of you. I don't think there were a lot of people that liked them. Anyway. And then for verse 41, then you answered me, we have sinned against Adonai. Now we will go up and fight in accordance with everything Adonai our God ordered us. And every man among you put on his arms, considering it an easy matter to go up into the hill country. So this is the next day after he said, now we have to go back because you didn't believe. And now the people say, no, we repent. We'll go in, we'll fight, we'll do whatever God has said. And now the issue is, God said, now forget it, go back. And no, we're going to do it. We're going to make it. We're going to do exactly what God said. Verse 42, but Adonai said to me, tell them, don't go up and don't fight because I am not there with you. If you do, your enemies will defeat you. So I told you, but you wouldn't listen. Instead, you rebelled against Adonai's order, took matters into your hands, and went up into the hill country. They still went up. When God now says, no, go back from where you came from. Where the Amorites living in that hill country came out against you like bees. And it's also interesting that the word bee in Hebrew is also debar. Like devarim, dabar, words, things, bees. So instead of hearing the devarim, the words of God, they got another devarim. They got bees all over them. So they came out against you like bees, defeated you in Seir, and chased you back all the way to Hormah. So they came back with their tail between their legs. You returned and cried before Adonai, but Adonai neither listened to you, to what you said, nor paid you any attention. This is why you had to stay in Kadesh as long as you did. Now, stay in Kadesh as long as you did, basically saying that for many years they stayed there. Okay, and then they kept wandering around the same mountain over and over. Why? Because that generation had to completely die. Chapter 2. Then we turned and began traveling into the desert along the road to the Sea of Suf, which is the Red Sea. So they have to go back. Remember, that's where they crossed. To then go into the Mount Sinai. As Adonai had said to me, and we skirted Mount Seir for a long time. Now, Mount Seir is the land that belongs to Esau, which another name is Edom. So anytime you see the name Edom or Esau or Mount Seir is the same thing. Verse 2. Finally, Adonai said to me, you have been going around this mountain long enough. Head north and give this order to the people. You are to pass through the territory of your kinsmen, the descendants of Esau, who live in Seir. They will be afraid of you. So be very cautious and don't get into disputes with them. For I am not going to give you any of their land, not even enough for 1 foot to stand on, inasmuch as I have given Mount Seir to Esau as his possession. Pay the money for the food you eat and pay the money for the water you drink. For Adonai your God has blessed you in everything your hands have produced. He knows that you have been traveling through this vast desert. These 40 years Adonai your God has been with you and you have lacked nothing. Remember that another thing about this people during this time is they were living these 40 years supernaturally. Why? Because they had manna. God gave them water. Their clothes lasted all those 40 years. Their shoes lasted. They says that not even their feet got swollen. So they were taken care of completely. They had a light by night. They had the pillar of fire at night. And during the day, they had this cloud covering over them. Because if you've ever been in the desert during the day is very, very hot. And the desert at night is very, very cold. So they had this fire. They had a warm, nice fire that was with them during the night. And during the day, they had this nice cloud over them to give them some refreshment from the heat to keep them cool. So they basically, they had everything, and they were spoiled, I mean, in a sense. But because of unbelief, they had to keep going around and around the mountain. So to be able to now go back in towards the promised land, they have to go through 3 different countries of people that are relatives. So we have that they have to go through Moab. They have to go through Edom or Seir, which is the same thing. And they have to go through Ammon. Now Moab and Ammon are the children of Lot. And because Lot was the nephew of Abraham, because of the merits of Abraham, God doesn't allow the people of Israel to have any discord or any war with Moab or Ammon. And Edom, which is Esau, is Jacob's brother. So therefore, it's also family. And even though they're family, they don't want them to go to the land. They don't let them go through the land because they're afraid of them. You have to remember that in spite of they not having Facebook, nor internet, nor Instagram, or anything, everything that happened, they knew of all the things that were happening with Israel. From the things that happened in Egypt, their defeat against Pharaoh, all the way through crossing through the wilderness. So they were afraid of them. And you have to remember that right before going into the land, through Moses, they defeated the kings of Og and Sihon, which were 2 great kings. They could not get into fights with these guys. And I've read that the sages say that this land of Moab, Edom, and Ammon, when Messiah comes back, he's going to take care of them. Okay, now at this point, Israel can't do anything about them. But when Messiah comes back, then he's going to, the big brother, then he's going to take care of these people. So basically, chapter 2 is speaking about they trying to go in through Edom, Moab, and Ammon, and everybody says, no, you can't. And so then they have the war with Sihon, king of Heshbon. And then in chapter 3 talks about Og, the king of Bashan. So by defeating these 2 kings, that land that is basically east of the Jordan, then we have that the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh won that land. Why? Because they had a lot of cattle and sheep and goats. And we know that that's the best part of Israel in terms of having animals. So please go. And so all the lands of these 2 kings and all their properties and all the things they had now is in the possession of Israel. In chapter 3, please go to verse 12. Chapter 3, verse 12. And remember, this is after capturing all the properties of those 2 kings of the Amorites. It says, of this land that we took possession of, then I assigned to the Reubenites and the Gadites the territory extending from Aroer along the Arnon Valley, together with half the hill country of Gilead, including its cities. The rest of Gilead and all Bashan, the kingdom of Og, I gave to the half tribe of Manasseh. The whole region of Argob, together with all of Bashan, formed what is called the land of Rephaim. Yair, the son of Manasseh, took all the region of Argob as far as the border with the Geshurites and the Maachites. He named this whole area, including Bashan, after himself. It remains Havot Yair to this day. I gave Gilead to Machir, and to the Reubenites and Gadites I gave the territory from Gilead to the Arnon Valley, with the middle of the valley as the border as far as the Yabok River, which is the border with the people of Ammon. The Arabah too, the Jordan being its border from Kinneret to the Sea of Arabah, the Dead Sea at the foot of the slopes of Pisgah to the east. So this is the territory that's going to belong to these 2.5 tribes. And again, it's because they have a lot of cattle and a lot of animals, and that's the best pasture land east of the Jordan. At that time, verse 18, I gave you this order. Adonai your God has given you this land to possess, but all of you who are fit to fight must cross over armed ahead of your brothers, the people of Israel. Your wives, your little ones, and your livestock, I know you have much livestock, will stay in your cities, which I have given you, until Adonai allows your brothers to rest, as he has allowed you, and they too take possession of the land Adonai your God is giving them on the west side of the Jordan. At that point, you will return each man to his own possession, which I have given you. So what he's saying here is that remember that these 2.5 tribes wanted to stay on the east side of the Jordan, and then all the land west of the Jordan was going to be the territories that was going to be given to the other tribes. So Moses is saying, before you settle down, you're going to have to go and fight with your brothers to make sure they get their inheritance. And once they have their inheritance, the other tribes, then you can go back to the east side of the Jordan. But until then, you have to go and fight with them and make sure they get their possessions too. Verse 21. Also at that time, I gave this order to Yehoshua, to Joshua. Your eyes have seen everything that Adonai your God has done to these 2 kings. Adonai will do the same to all the kingdoms you encounter when you cross over. Don't be afraid of them, because Adonai your God will fight on your behalf. So he's telling Joshua basically the same way that God was with me, with this people and fighting against these kings, God will also be with you. Don't be afraid into going into the land, because you have to remember they have to go into the land and get rid of all the people there, of all the ites, and of all the altars, and of all the idols, and all those things, so they can start anew in the land being cleaned up. Okay. So basically, that is the Torah portion, but something that we also need to go over is that the book of Deuteronomy, and we have spoken about this before, is the book of Deuteronomy is written in the format of a covenant. And the format is according to the way it was written in the ancient Middle East and the ancient Near East. In the ancient Near East, there was a format where kings would write up covenants with other nations. And so the way the whole book of Deuteronomy is written is written in the format of this type of covenant, specifically the one of the Suzerain and Vassal Covenant. Okay, where you have a suzerain king or sovereign king who's in charge of a vassal kingdom. And the vassal kingdom is under this suzerain king. And so they have this covenant, and this format has several parts to it. So when you study the book of Deuteronomy and you look into it, you're going to see that it's going to follow exactly the same pattern of all the covenants of the ancient Near East that were called suzerain and vassal covenants or treaties. Okay. So before we do that, please go to Galatians chapter 3. Galatians chapter 3, verse 15. To the book of Galatians chapter 3, verse 15. Galatians 3, verse 15 says, brothers, let me make an analogy from everyday life. When someone swears an oath, no one else can set it aside or add to it. Even though here says swears an oath, really what it's trying to say, when someone makes a covenant. Brothers, let me make an analogy from everyday life. When someone makes a covenant, no one else can set it aside or add to it. In other words, once a covenant is made, you can't add to it or you can't take away from it. It has to be fulfilled exactly the way it was written, exactly the way it was given. Do you have a different translation, Diane?
The King James.
Yeah, what does it say?
15.
Yes, please.
Brethren, I speak after the manner of men. Though it be that the man's covenant, yet it be confirmed, no man disannuls or adds thereto.
Okay, so covenant, no one can annul it, change it, or add to it. Okay, so the same thing, if this is between men, imagine with God. Because God is eternal, his covenant is also eternal. No one can add to it, no one can take away from it. So the parts of the covenant of a suzerain vassal king has the following. First part is what's called the preamble. And you can find that is going to be chapter 1, verse 1 through verse 5. The preamble is kind of like an introduction, letting you know who's making the covenant and who's presenting the covenant. So God is making the covenant with Israel, and Moses is presenting it to the people. Then you have what's called a historic prologue. And what this is saying in chapter 1, verse 6 through chapter 10, verse 11, is giving you a history of all the things that the sovereign king or suzerain king has done for his vassals, for his vassal kingdom. Okay, you have the suzerain king and you have the vassals, and the vassal is subject to the suzerain king. Okay, it's like the Queen of England. She's the queen, and all the people of England are her vassals. Okay, so in this case, Hashem is our suzerain king, and we are his vassal. We are his servants. We are under him. So the covenant is going to have these parts to it, and you're going to see it in the whole book of Deuteronomy is an example of this type of covenant. It's going to be a preamble, which is chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, which is an introduction of who's doing the covenant and who's presenting the covenant. A historic prologue, which is telling us what the king, the sovereign, has done for us, for his vassals. Then we have what's called stipulations. The stipulations is going to tell you the obligations of the vassal to the sovereign king. The stipulations are going to tell the vassal how to be faithful and loyal to their king. So you're going to read about that in chapters 10, verse 12, through chapter 26, verse 19. So you have preamble, historic prologue, and the stipulations, which is what the vassal is responsible of doing in favor of the suzerain or the sovereign king. Basically, this has to do with loyalty and faithfulness to the king. And another term for loyal and faithfulness is love. This is how you show your love to your king, being loyal and faithful to him. Then you have to have a place where you're going to deposit the covenant. In the case of Israel, the commandments were put into the Ark of the Covenant. So you have to have a place where you put the covenant, and then you have to give a time frame for when this covenant is going to be read to the people every so often. In terms of Israel, the covenant is read on Sukkot. Okay. During the festival of Sukkot, during those 7 days, the Torah is read to the people every 7th year. Okay. During the Shemitah, if it's a Shemitah year, that Sukkot of that Shemitah year, the covenant is read to the people. So the custom was to read the whole Torah during those 7 days. Why? Because the Torah is the covenant. And then part of that format is you have to talk about witnesses. And you're going to find that well, this depository is in, this here is in chapter 27, verse 1 through 9. Verse 31, chapter 31, verses 9 through 13, and verses 24 and 26. Okay, this is going to be telling you about where to deposit the covenant and when you're going to read it to the people. As for the witnesses of the covenant with Israel is the heavens and the earth. And you're going to find that in chapter 31, verse 28, and chapter 32, verse 1. Okay, so again, according to the ancient Near East covenant format of a suzerain and vassal covenant or treaty, it has to have a preamble, has to have a historic prologue, has to have stipulations, has to have a place to deposit the covenant and time frame when it's going to be read to the people, and witnesses. You have to present who are the witnesses. And we will see that all these parts, the whole book of Deuteronomy has it. And the last part of the covenant is going to be the blessings and the curses. Okay. The blessings and the curses. And that's going to be found in chapter 28, verse 1 through chapter 29, verse 1. Why? Because the people have accepted this covenant. Remember, they accepted this covenant on Mount Sinai. They said, yes, whatever you say, we will do. Therefore, if you follow the covenant is going to include a list of curses and blessings. If you follow the covenant, which you said you were going to follow, you will get the blessings. But if you don't follow the covenant, you're going to get the curses. And it's not that God curses us. We ourselves curse us when we don't follow and don't obey to what we said we were going to do. So when we come to Messiah, Yeshua, basically, what people call the confession of faith, you're basically making an oath. And what is that oath? That oath is the covenant. So when you say you accept Yeshua as your Lord, as your suzerain, basically, that's another way of saying suzerain, you're agreeing to this covenant. Okay, by you saying that you accept Yeshua into your life as your Lord and Savior, what you're saying is you're accepting him as your suzerain, and you are now his vassal. You're saying yes to this covenant. And so if you follow through this covenant, you're going to get the blessings that are already written in the book of Deuteronomy. If you don't follow through, then the curses are going to come. And it's interesting that if you study any of the other covenants made in the ancient Near East of other nations, I think that this covenant is the only one that has blessings in it. Everybody else just had curses. So either you do it or you do it. So, but this one, again, God is not the one that curses us. We curse ourselves when we don't obey. Okay? So when you spoke with your, that's why in Romans it says you speak with your mouth and believe in your heart. Okay, why? Because you have to have witnesses to what you're saying. You're making an oath. It's like when you go to the court. You have to put your hand on the Bible and make an oath, and everybody has to hear you. Okay, so the same way you have to confess Yeshua. And by confessing, that's another way of saying you're coming into a covenant. And so you're agreeing to this. So if you break it by disobedience, then instead of blessings, you're going to have curses. So the whole book of Deuteronomy, if you take it to a lawyer, he will agree with every single step that I have put here. And it's the book of Deuteronomy is a complete legal document. And I've said this before, had Israel used the Torah as their constitution when they became a nation in 1948, they wouldn't have the problems they have now. And not only is it a constitution, it's also their legal document of their property, that the land is their property. It's a deed to the land. Had they used the Torah, they wouldn't be having the problems they have right now. Because remember that the book of Deuteronomy is a summary of the other 4 books. So if you don't remember anything else of all the rest of the Torah, if you know that the book of Deuteronomy at least, that is your deed to the land, and that is the constitution, and that is the covenant that gives you the blessing if you walk in obedience. Okay? It's the deed to the land, to your inheritance, and it's also the constitution of the kingdom, which is the covenant between the Suzerain king, which is Yeshua, and we are his servants or his vassals. And this is still today legally binding. Like I said, if you take it to a lawyer, the lawyer will agree that it's a complete legal document till today, till this day. Okay, so it has that legal weight. And just to, even though this was not part of the Torah portion, right there in chapter 4, if you go to chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, in chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, the way it's written, it's a covenant language, and it's also a legal formula. Anytime you read this, it lets you know it's a covenant. It's the language of a covenant, and it's a legal formula. And it says, verse 1 of chapter 4, Deuteronomy. Now, Israel, listen to the Torah and rulings I am teaching you, in order to follow them so that you will live. Then you will go in and take possession of the land that Adonai, the God of your fathers, is giving you. In order to obey the mitzvot or commandments of Adonai your God, which I am giving you, do not add to what I am saying and do not subtract from it. You do it exactly as it is written. You cannot make it up. You cannot add to it. You cannot take away from it. You cannot say, well, I don't like this and I do like this, or I'm going to change it this way. That is legally, God has the right to sue you for that. Anytime you come and change what his Torah says, what his covenant says, he has the legal right to come against you. And that is what the book of Revelation is. The book of Revelation is a legal suit against the people for breaking the covenant. Those 7 letters that are called the 7 letters of the church or congregations is nothing else than a legal suit against the people for breaking the covenant. If you see the book of Revelation in terms of a covenant and covenant language, you will understand it better than if you read it and listen to all this other garbage as people try to explain it. And let me show you, if you go, remember what we just read in verse 2 of chapter 4, Deuteronomy. Do not add to what I'm saying and do not subtract to it. You're going to say, well, Pastor, where's that in the New Testament? Well, I'm glad you asked. Please go to chapter 22 of Revelation. Chapter 22 of Revelation, verse 18. 22:18. Because remember that the book of Revelation is written in covenant language. It says, I warn everyone hearing the words of the prophecy in this book that if anyone adds to them, God will add to him the plagues written in this book. And if anyone takes anything away from the words in the book of this prophecy, God will take away his share in the tree of life and the holy city as described in this book. That is a legal covenant formula. So we cannot add to it and we cannot take away from it. So people that have tried to change the Torah by adding things or taking away from it, God has the legal right to sue, and I assure you he will win. He's the best of lawyers. Okay? So the book of Revelation is written in covenant language. It's a suit against the people, a lawsuit against the people for breaking covenant. So whenever you get a chance, go and read those 7 letters and you will see. It has the same format. It has a preamble, it had a historic prologue, it has stipulations, it has witnesses, it has blessings, and it has curses. If you look for it, you will find it. Okay? And then just to go a little bit over, something else that I wanted to say about the book of Deuteronomy. In the apostolic writings in the New Testament, the book of Deuteronomy or Devarim is the book that is most quoted in the New Testament, over 100 times. Just to give you an example, in the Gospel of Matthew, the book of Deuteronomy is referenced 15 times. In Mark, 12. In Luke, 6. In John, 12. In Acts, twice. In the book of Romans, 7 times. In 1 Corinthians, 14 times. In 2 Corinthians, 4 times. In Galatians, 4 times. In 1 Timothy, 2 times. In the book of Hebrews, 9 times. And in the book of Revelation, the book of Deuteronomy is referenced 13 times. So do you think it's important? Because it's the legal document. It has all the components of a legal document that is still today as good as it was given the first time. Legally. It's legally binding. So anytime that when people break the covenant, they have no idea what they're getting into. Okay. So just take a few minutes to go over in Isaiah. Remember that today is Shabbat Chazon. So if you can please go to Isaiah chapter 1. And this is the third reading of affliction. And it's of affliction because of this week. Like I was saying, the eve of this Wednesday, the 29th of July, starts the 9th of Av. And the 9th of Av has to do with the destruction of the temples and other things. It also has to do with the bad report of the spies. So this last portion of the readings of affliction, again, is God complaining about what Israel has done. So this is what's going on. So again, what's going to happen in this vision, that's why it's called Shabbat Chazon, because Isaiah has had this vision. And so the vision is going to be about the destruction of Jerusalem, okay? And why the destruction of Jerusalem? Because God has the legal right to sue them because they broke the covenant. Now, another way of saying a formal legal indictment or suit is called a riv. A riv, not rib, a riv. A riv means that God has the legal right to come against people that have broken the covenant. Yeah, this in Hebrew, riv. Okay. Many times it's translated as I have an issue with you, or other things. But if you look it up in the Hebrew, it's riv. And it means a formal legal indictment. So verse 1 of Isaiah chapter 1 says, this is the vision, this is the chazon of Isaiah, the son of Amoz, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. So this prophecy is for Judah and Jerusalem specifically. During the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. So that means that Isaiah was alive during these 4 kings. During this time of these 4 kings in Judah, Isaiah was there prophesying to these 4 kings. Verse 2, hear heaven, listen earth. Why? Because those are the witnesses of the covenant. For Adonai is speaking. I raised and brought up children, but they rebelled against me. An ox knows its owner, and a donkey its master's stall, but Israel does not know, my people do not reflect. So he's saying basically an ox and a donkey are smarter than you guys, in a way, because they know what to do, and yet you guys don't know what you're doing. Verse 4, O sinful nation, a people weighed down by iniquity, descendants of evildoers, immoral children. They have abandoned Adonai, spurned the Holy One of Israel, turned their backs on him. Where should I strike you next as you persist in rebelling? The whole head is sick, the whole heart diseased. From the sole of the foot to the head, there is nothing healthy. only wounds, bruises, and festering sores that haven't been dressed or bandaged or softened up with oil. Your land is desolate. Remember that this is a vision that Isaiah is having. So he's seeing the land desolate and destroyed. Your land is desolate. Your cities are burned to the ground. Foreigners devour your land in your presence. It's as desolate as if overwhelmed by floods. The daughter of Zion is left like a shack in a vineyard, like a shed in a cucumber field, like a city under siege. If Adonai Sebaot had not left us a tiny, tiny remnant, we would have become like Sodom, and we would have resembled Gomorrah. So the issues is the following. This is the list of things that the people of Israel, when you read and look in this short paragraph: rebellion, abandonment, corruption, violence, injustice, apostasy, materialism, idolatry, immorality, and occultism. So all those things the people of Israel were doing. So do you think that God has a right to go against them? Verse 9 again. If Adonai Sebaot had not left us a tiny, tiny remnant, we would have become like Sodom. We would have resembled Gomorrah. Hear what Adonai says. You rulers of Sodom, listen to God's Torah, your people of Gomorrah. So he's calling the people of Israel, the princes and the rulers, like Sodom and Gomorrah. In other words, they're worse than they were. Why are all those sacrifices offered to me, asked Adonai? I'm fed up with burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fattened animals. I get no pleasure from the blood of bulls, lambs, and goats. And the thing is, when people read this, it's not that God is against the offerings and that God is against the things that were done in the temple. What he's against is that the people are doing this without having a heart into it. They're doing it maybe from obligation. They're doing it because they have no other choice, or they're doing it because they're accustomed to it, but they're not doing it because they feel it. They're not doing it for God. They're not doing it with the right purpose or the right meaning. Verse 12, yes, you come to appear in my presence, but who asked you to do this? You trampled through my courtyard. Stop bringing worthless grain offerings. They are like disgusting incense to me. Rosh Chodesh, Shabbat, calling convocations. I can't stand evil together with your assemblies. Everything in me hates your Rosh Chodesh and your festivals. They are a burden to me. I'm tired of putting up with them. And again, it's not that God is against these things. He's against the attitude with which the people are doing these things. And this is the clue to why he's so mad. It says, when you spread out your hands, I will hide my eyes from you. No matter how much you pray, I won't be listening. Because your hands are covered with blood. The people were committing homicides. The people were committing injustice. The people were not doing justice to the widow, to the orphan, to the stranger. They were doing everything against Torah. So what does he say? He gives them an advice. He says, wash yourselves clean. Get your evil deeds out of my sight. Stop doing evil. Learn to do good. Seek justice. Relieve the oppressed. Defend orphans. Plead for the widow. Because they were not doing these things. And then he says, once you do these things, come now, says Adonai. Then you can bring me your offerings. Then you can celebrate New Moon. Then you can celebrate the festivals and Shabbat. But don't do it when outside the congregation, you're doing all this junk. You're doing all this evil. You're terrible out there in the world. But then you come to church and you're like, holy am I and righteous. Okay, because people, think that nobody's watching you, but God is watching you. Okay, so outside the congregation, outside the churches, outside the synagogue, outside the temple, they were doing all these horrible things, and then they would come in like nothing had happened. So that's why God didn't want to have to do anything with what they brought. Verse 18, come now, says Adonai, let's talk this over together. Even if your sins are like scarlet, they will be white as snow. Even if they are red as crimson, they will be like wool. If you are willing and obedient, he gives us, it's a choice, people. It's a choice. If you are willing and obedient, you will eat the good of the land. But if you refuse and rebel, you will be eaten by the sword, for the mouth of Adonai has spoken. How the faithful city has become a whore. Once she was filled with justice, righteousness lodged in her, but now murderers. Your silver is no longer pure, your wine is watered down, your leaders are rebels, friends of thieves. They all love bribes and run after gifts. They give no justice to orphans. The widow's complaint doesn't catch their attention. Sounds like what's happening today. Therefore says the Lord Adonai Tsebaot, the mighty one of Israel, I will free myself of my adversaries. I will take vengeance on my enemies. And who here are his adversaries and enemies? They're his own people. But I will also turn my hand against you. I will cleanse your impurities as with lye and remove all your alloyed base metal. I will restore your judges as at first and your advisors as at the beginning. After that, you will be called the city of righteousness, faithful city. Zion will be redeemed by justice, and those in her who repent by righteousness. In other words, there is hope, but only God can make those changes in the people. But if the people are not willing and obedient, none of this is going to happen. So this is the last reading of the portions of affliction. And so starting next Shabbat, we go into what's called the 7 weeks of consolation. Because remember that we're going to commemorate the destruction of the temples. But God, like a loving father, he can reprimand you, he can chastise you, but eventually he wants you back, and he wants to embrace us, and he wants to love us, and he wants to take care of us, and he wants us to keep walking with him in righteousness and justice. So that's why the next 7 weeks is weeks of consolation, because he's going to try to get the people to come back to him with the right heart, with the right attitude. So with that, we basically finished the Torah portion. Now we can go to some questions.